Don't talk, just listen.
The man's voice was hoarse and low, but steady like a taut rope, pulling Rachel to a halt right beside the patrol car door. In front of her stood a homeless black man leaning against the rain-soaked brick wall, shoulders of his worn coat dark with water, hair, and beard, disheveled from the cold wind, yet his eyes were strikingly clear. At his feet, the dog Max blocked half its body toward the alley, hackles raised, a deep, disciplined growl vibrating from its chest. Instinct made Rachel press her back lightly against the car's side, her hand brushing the grip of her gun out of habit. But it was the tone of the man's voice, firm, not wavering. No slur of alcohol that made her pause. "Behind you," he repeated, eyes locked on the alley's shadows. "He's waiting there. I saw him follow you when you pulled in." The drizzle thickened, drumming harder on the lid of a trash can. Rachel's gaze flicked through the dark patches, damp brick walls, black smears of plastic bags, a gust carrying the tang of cold metal. Nothing clear until the faint scrape of a shoe cut through the rain, and a glint of metal caught the streetlight, answering her instinct a knife. Police. Rachel dropped her weight, pivoting for a clear angle. Max barked once sharp and loud, just as the man hurled himself from the wall in a full-body tackle, colliding with the figure sliding out of the alley. The attacker lunged at Rachel, blade flashing silver in his raised arm. She drew her gun by drilled reflex, steadied her breath, and fired skyward, shattering the fragile instant of imbalance. The shot split the rain. The assailant faltered just enough for the homeless man to wrench his arm, pin his shoulder, and shove the blade a hair's breadth away from Rachel, no more than half a fingertip. The knife clattered on the wet ground. Rachel kicked it out of reach, swung her flashlight to blind the attacker, and cut off his options. Max circled, barking sharp bursts to box him in. Amid rain and ragged breathing, Rachel closed from the safe side and snapped the cuffs with a final click that ended the spasms of violence. She held her gun a moment longer, watching the man's muscles sag in defeat, then turned her focus to her unlikely rescuer. He was breathing hard, shoulders rising and falling, soaked hair plastered to his forehead. Max stood half guarding him, eyes calmer now that the threat was contained. Aftermath always thickened the air, sounds magnified, smells mingled, and in the middle of it, Rachel spoke only one word, the only one that fit. "Thank you." The red-blue flash of another cruiser spilled into the alley's mouth, but the simple truth was already written tonight. Her life had been saved by a homeless black man and his dog. The team rushed in scene tape, sagging with rain-clipped exchanges, mixed with the smell of wet nylon and metal. A few glances darted toward the drenched man, and the dog braced in front of him, half curious, half wary, the kind of look Rachel had seen too many times in this city. She cut through the murmurs with a single sharp line. "He saved my life." The weight of those words dropped like a stone on concrete. People stepped around it and fell silent. Rachel pulled a thin blanket, and a still warm meal from the trunk held them out. "Hospital. That gash on your arm needs checking." He shook his head, the practiced shake of someone long weary of white lights, and the same questions about papers, insurance, addresses. "No hospital," he said quietly, eyes dodging the stares. She didn't press. She set the blanket on his shoulders, nudged the food closer, crouched so her voice met him eye level. "I'm Rachel Cole, and you?" A pause light as rain, cut by an awning, then David. "David Brooks." She nodded, repeating his name, slow, clear, as if carving it into memory. "Good to meet you, David." The attacker was hauled off. The alley cleared. David wrapped himself in the blanket, Max pressed against his shin ears, swiveling at each faint sound. Rachel lingered, a thin sting tightening her chest, an undercurrent of shame for her first flicker of doubt, and for the blind spots her badge sometimes reinforced. This city had learned to pass by people like David. Tonight, the man passed over had held her back from a blade. Back at the precinct, her report was brief enough for the file to move along. Some scoffed at the instinct of a homeless guy, some didn't care. Rachel didn't argue. She carried the truth quietly, like a warm stone in her pocket. That night, she struggled to sleep every time she closed her eyes. The first words returned. Don't talk, just listen. The scrape of a shoe, the flare of a knife, the click of cuffs snapping shut. By morning, amid a schedule packed tight, Rachel inserted a task that wasn't on the roster: find David. She checked church pantries, shelters, soup kitchens. Everyone had heard of a black man with a good dog. No one knew where he slept. Big cities swallowed people softly. Stories traveled faster than the bodies they were tied to. Days later, she spotted Max before she saw David, ears pricked, tail wagging, as her car eased to the curb. David lifted his head, face calm, as if used to people showing up and then vanishing. Thought you'd forgotten, he said, without reproach. Never. Rachel set down a paper bag, sandwiches, water, warm wipes. They sat on damp steps, watching the rain thin. Why did you do it? She asked, gentle but direct. David stroked Max's ear eyes on the dark concrete. Because no one else would. And because when you looked at me, you didn't look like I was trash. The words were compact, heavy, shifting something in Rachel's chest. From then, a rhythm formed, sometimes a hot coffee, sometimes a dry blanket, sometimes just 10 minutes talking about the wind or a church meal schedule. Fragments of David's past surfaced: an accident that buried him under hospital bills, the job and home lost after. But within the cracks, anchors remained. He spoke several languages, remembered streets like a living map, heard better than any police radio. Max has saved me plenty of times, he said, half joking, half true. Rachel believed him without proof. One stormy night, under a bridge wind slicing sharp as knives, she found them huddled together. Come to the station tonight, she offered, not as an order. David hesitated. White lights and questions never sat well, but Max nudged his knee like a nod. At the station, a few hard looks swept over, but Rachel's old line, he saved my life, reset the room. David ate a hot meal, slept on a folding bed left by morning. Feels strange, he said, like I don't belong, but also like I remember I'm still someone. Rachel answered simply, you never lost that. Peace never lasted long. One gray afternoon, 3 punks cornered David by a warehouse wall, yanked Max's leash, mouths full of cruel jokes. Rachel's headlights cut them stiff. They scattered when another siren approached. David bore bruises, scratches along his arm. Rachel cleaned them with her kit. You don't owe me, he said, holding the boundary. You saved me first, she replied, pressing the bandage like a sealed promise. That night she slipped a folded note into his coat pocket. If tomorrow is too heavy, sit on the old steps. I'll come. David never sat waiting. Survivors rarely did, but he kept the note. And sometimes simply having something to keep was the difference that mattered. The urgent call came in near the end of shift, a child about 7 missing in the Central Park. Night had fallen, rain tapping again, grinding patience thin. Rachel swung her car around the area, headlights sweeping over damp paths and muddy footprints across the grass. The parents pointed with trembling hands toward the playground, where a swing still swayed faintly like a memory refusing to stop. Search teams spread out, calling the child's name in sync with the radio waves. Time dragged each 10 minutes, a cold stab in the chest. Rachel was checking the row of low-maintenance sheds at the park's edge when she spotted Max first, ears up, eyes scanning with intent. David followed, coat darkened by rain steps, steady as if guided by an invisible thread. You need a nose, he said quickly, voice deep and concise. Max is sharp with wet fabric and the scent of fear. It wasn't protocol, but Rachel had no time for paperwork. She nodded, handed over the small scarf the child had left on a bench. Max buried his muzzle and inhaled deeply, then pulled the leash toward the locked service shed where damp wood and old paint blended into a whisper that prickled the nerves. In there, David said, eyes fixed on the door. I hear held-back breathing. Another officer raised a brow skeptical. Rachel just signaled to break the lock. The metal screeched, the door swung open into a dark, dusty reek. A child, curled in the corner, eyes wide with fear, clutching a thin raincoat. Someone cried out. The mother swept him into her arms, sobs tangling with the rain drumming on tin. Amid the commotion, David stepped back, hand resting on Max's head in thanks. The dog knew, he murmured, and as usual, when eyes began to turn his way, he slipped toward the edge of shadow. Rachel followed, halted him with a small nod. Thank you again. He shrugged, as if it were just the ordinary work of someone paying attention. But Rachel knew tonight she had enough reason, enough proof to knock on the one door that might finally open for David. The next morning, Captain Miller sat behind his scarred wooden desk, pen tapping in its habitual rhythm. Rachel laid it out the rainy night with the knife, the warning voice, the mid-air shot the takedown that saved her. The punks who jumped David and Max, and last night the locked shed the child found because of Max's nose. Miller, seasoned in hearing helpful stories, kept his face blank at first. Cole, I can't fold a stranger into procedure based on anecdotes. Rachel didn't raise her voice. She simply placed the pieces in order. Sir, this isn't anecdote. You have the knife assault report, the attacker's name notes of David's presence. You have the missing child call, the time of the forced lock. And more than that, you have a real gap. Our precinct lacks language support for immigrant families, lacks a bridge to those living outside the system. David speaks Spanish, knows this area like a map, hears things the radio misses. Miller's pen stilled. He leaned back. Fine, bring him in. I'll listen. Not a full yes, but a third of a door cracked open. So that afternoon, under cold neon and the rattle of an old coffee machine, David Brooks and Max crossed the precinct threshold, stepping over the line between street and system. David stood straighter than usual, though his hand clutched Max's leash like a lifeline. Miller studied him, heard Rachel's clipped introduction, then asked a few slow questions, what he'd done before, where he lived, what he could offer. David didn't embellish. He'd worked loading docks, half-finished a Spanish class with a roommate years back, lived these streets long enough to know every shutter's schedule, could tell the footsteps of neighbors apart. I'm not asking for charity, he finished, gaze steady. I can be useful. It was likely that phrase be useful that tipped Miller's decision. He offered a cautious solution. Part-time. Interpreter for immigrant outreach guide when needed, accompany an officer in the field. Not a cop, no weapon, stipend, 30-day trial. David glanced at Max as if waiting for a nudge. Rachel leaned close enough for only him to hear, "This isn't charity, it's purpose." That line unlocked the last hinge. David nodded. I accept. On the way out, Max tugged the leash once, like a sigh of relief. David paused in the lobby, staring at the frosted glass reflecting three figures, himself, Rachel the captain, an odd triangle that somehow didn't look out of place. The white light was foreign, the questioning eyes would linger. But last night a child had been returned, and this morning a door had cracked open. Some rare days the city stopped swallowing people and instead spit out a path forward. The first day always carried more whispers than usual. David arrived on time in an old but clean shirt, hair combed into neat curls. Max wore a new collar Rachel had bought, its small tag clicking each time he tilted his head. Down the hallway, surprise mixed with caution. In a few glances, a homeless black man, his dog, a temporary badge, stamped visitor glinting on his pocket. Rachel walked beside him like a steady frame. She didn't speak for him, but her presence told the whole room this man was invited, not intruding. The morning passed slowly through orientation safety briefings, rules, patrol routes. Near noon, a family arrived, speaking rapid Spanish, a couple in their 30s, their little girl clutching a cloth doll. Their words tumbled out broken by worry, by the lack of equivalents. The desk officer faltered, eyes darting. Rachel slid her chair back, David. He sat down, leaning slightly forward to close the gap, starting with the simple greetings he'd heard for years among the Latino community. The mother's breath eased, the father's grip loosened. The issue turned out simple, but without language it had been a wall, a small theft at the market, lost papers, fear of trouble with visas. David translated not just words, but fear into the language of process so the process could stop being cold. The system moved, the report was filed, the room's eyes softened as if someone had turned down a harsh light. By afternoon, word had made a circuit. The new guy helped. David didn't speak much. He chose to stand at the room's edge, listening, stepping in with a line only when needed. Max rotated between sunny spots, lifting his head whenever children entered the lobby. Kids always noticed the dog before the man. They reached for Max's ears, then followed the leash to David's hand, and only then looked up at his face. Those small moments, never on any KPI sheet, were what began to change the air in the building. Of course not. Everyone shifted in a day. In the corner, whispers still scratched like nylon on chairs, bringing a homeless guy into the precinct. What guarantees? Rachel didn't fight them with speeches. She let outcomes speak. Late in the day, Miller walked by, paused long enough to watch David, pointing an old man toward the welfare office, not police work, but human work. He gave Rachel a slight nod, no words. For someone long seasoned in the job, the kindest acknowledgement was often silence in place of old doubts. At the lot, as Rachel dropped David back where he still spent nights, she caught herself asking, "First day, okay." David smiled, a rare, unpracticed smile, but real at the eyes. "Better than I thought," he said. "And strange thing is, I want to come back tomorrow." A line that seemed ordinary, but for someone who had lived on the margins, it was a milestone. Wanting to return meant he had found a reason to belong. Night fell, the city still spinning its other stories. But in one small precinct room, 2 new lists had been taped to the whiteboard, language support. Morning shift David B. and Max's vet check, Friday afternoon. Trivial details, perhaps yet together. They stitched the seam of a bond just beginning, keeping it from unraveling under old habits. And in the frayed pocket of his shirt, David still kept the folded notes Rachel once left, not for nostalgia, but as a reminder that this path was no longer one he walked alone. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm both strange and comforting. Mornings found David helping with intake and interpretation. Afternoons he joined the community outreach team at flea markets. And in the evenings Rachel sometimes steered her car down the streets where he slept, bringing a hot cup of coffee in exchange for a few minutes of talk and Max's wagging tail. No ceremony was ever named, but walking together slowly became a silent pact. She in uniform, he in the old boots, now dried, and Max trotting alongside his tag, clinking like a steady reminder that everyone was exactly where they needed to be. At the 15th Street Market, a small clash nearly exploded. A Mexican produce seller accused a regular customer of hiding goods, the customer shouting back that he'd been insulted. It was like a knot of wet rope, sticky heavy and liable to slip until David stepped in with a few short sentences in Spanish, laying out the market's refund process, assuring them that calling the police here didn't mean someone would be taken away. Rachel stood back, letting him translate fear into words the system could manage. When the 2 men finally shook hands, she gave David a simple nod, the kind teammates use to recognize each other without words. That night at Maple's corner basketball court, a boy in a cap lingered against the fence, eyes locked on an older group using signals that weren't exactly a game. David didn't lecture. He beckoned the boy over, tossed out small talk about which team had won, then pulled a warm bag of chestnuts from his pocket, cracking them open as he told a story about Max nearly tumbling into a bike's path and how a friend had held the leash just in time. Sometimes you just need someone to hold the leash for you. That's all. The boy burst out laughing, turned away, and when the older kids called from the corner, he just waved tomorrow and ran home. Rachel, watching from a distance, felt her chest ease with a quiet drop. Some turns in life happen so silently, only someone standing in the right spot could see them. Word about David, the homeless black man turned bridge, spread down the hallways by the fastest route usefulness. One noon, Captain Miller called Rachel into his office. He didn't circle around. "You're different, Cole." She braced, expecting a lecture on being too emotional. Instead, Miller leaned back the corner of his mouth, twitching like he was dusting off something long held back. Different in a good way. You're fighting for what's worth fighting for, and you haven't forgotten why you wear the badge. Maybe we all need someone like David to remind us of the reason we started. He didn't give a speech. He tapped his pen twice on the desk, the kind of short, firm period that closed a conversation. That evening, Rachel invited David to dinner at her small apartment. He arrived on time, awkwardly, holding a bundle of wildflowers tied with twine by a corner vendor. He looked almost comical, unsure of the ritual of bringing flowers, but the clumsiness warmed the kitchen when she lit the lights. They ate pasta. Rachel cooked their talk, punctuated with easy silences. David mentioned a half-finished Spanish class he'd once taken with a mechanic roommate. Rachel confessed her first failure at the shooting range, haunted by the ear-splitting sound of a bullet skimming wide. When he washed dishes, she draped the towel over the sink and glanced over to find Max curled under the table, twitching in dreams of running. Ordinary enough to be unforgettable. Of course, pasts don't slip away after a few dinners. Some nights David vanished. No shifts, borrowed phone dead, usual haunts empty. Rachel had learned not to panic. She looped past the church, the soup kitchen, finally the bridge where she'd find man and dog tucked into a wall niche against the wind. She didn't ask why didn't deliver a lecture about responsibility. She left a bottle of water and warm wipes, whispered, "See you tomorrow," and left. And each time he showed up the next day, clean enough to face himself, seated at the interpreter's desk, beginning with a clear greeting to the first family through the door. His on-time return, no promises, no declarations, was the truest promise he could make. One Friday afternoon, as Rachel was signing papers, Miller walked through the lobby and caught sight of Max welcoming guests, two children giggling as they stroked his ears, then looking up to greet Mr. David in both English and Spanish. Miller said nothing, only stood longer than needed to be sure he saw what he saw. Turning away, he left a single line in the air. "Keep him on the schedule longer, Cole." Rachel answered with the quietest, "Yes, sir." On the whiteboard that evening, someone had written in marker, "David B., morning shift permanent." Not a medal, but the kind of safeguard that kept a life just risen from the water from being dragged back under by waves. Night settled the city, holding its breath. On the balcony, Rachel handed David a blank sheet, asked what he wanted to write. He hesitated, then neatly signed his name, David Brooks, and below it, interpreter, community liaison. She didn't praise, only smiled, but the smile was enough to make him turn his head slightly to hide the weight in his face. Sometimes being called by the right name and the right role was the greatest gift of all. News of the child rescued from the locked shed didn't stop at the district line. A few local papers turned it into the story of a hero without a badge, complete with a photo of David standing beside Max, half sheepish, half proudly unable to hide it. The precinct decided on a small ceremony. No fanfare, just a flag backdrop, a few rows of chairs, and a scuffed microphone. David came in a new shirt. Rachel had helped him choose the store's crease line still sharp. Max wore a clean collar, his tag shining as if freshly polished. When the MC called him up, David walked slowly, one hand unconsciously gripping Max's leash like it was steadying his heartbeat. He didn't recount heroics, didn't replay the knife in the rain or the rusted lock. He spoke briefly like someone who had learned that being forgotten meant you saved words for what mattered. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone given another chance. Don't look at me. Look at the people you pass by every day. They matter too. The words landed soft but deep, like a stone dropped at the center of still water. Applause rose not fiery, but with the weight of people realizing they were part of the message. Rachel stood off to the right, fingers laced in front of her to hide the slight tremor in her thumb. When David stepped down, she didn't say a formal congratulations. She just brushed her hand across the back of his a brief, solid anchor. That evening, they walked home, city lights scattering gold salt across the wet pavement. At a crosswalk, Rachel took his hand. He stiffened half a beat, unused to being held, then loosened, letting warmth climb from his wrist to his shoulder. "Do you think about tomorrow?" she asked softly, as if borrowing a dream. David glanced at Max, then back at her, and for the first time in years said the words that once embarrassed him. "Now I do." In the months after, temporary became permanent. David B's name on the duty board stopped being dry erase and became a printed line in the weekly roster, a small but solid rivet. He began caring about the small things street life had never allowed, timing the laundry, so his shirt dried before morning shift, keeping a jar of chestnuts. Max loved noting the vet appointment Rachel had penciled in with a smiley face. There were still nights of sleeplessness when the past tugged at his sleeve, but now he could text Rachel a single word, "Okay." And he knew by morning someone would ask, "Did you eat?" without suspicion in their eyes. One day, Rachel took him to see a small third-floor apartment near the park. White walls, worn wooden floor, but intact a window opening on a hawthorn tree. The landlady, a widowed woman downstairs, spoke briskly about trash pickup mailboxes and never feeding Max chocolate. David stood in the empty living room afternoon light, cutting across the frame so long that Rachel thought he was looking for flaws to refuse it. Then he turned, voice hushed, almost afraid to break the air at home. A word casual to many, but to him it was a door unlocked with many keys, trust work, and the folded notes still tucked in a pocket, now washed clean. Move-in day brought no truck, just a few small cartons, a battered book, a coat weathered through seasons, a dented steel cup, and at the bottom of one box every folded note Rachel had left him. She laughed at her own scrawls. "Stay warm. I'm on night shift Thursday. Soup at the church." David flushed but didn't hide them. "They reminded me I wasn't gone," he said simply. In the still echoing space, Rachel stocked the kitchen cabinet with pasta, olive oil, a few packs of tea. Max inspected every corner before settling near the window, claiming it as his bed with a long sigh, as if he owned the place already. When the bustle calmed, David stood before Rachel, his hands fumbling for each other as if needing to hold on to something. "You saved me," he said, not as thanks, but as if testing whether the words could exist outside his chest. Rachel shook her head, her voice both warm and firm. "You saved yourself. I only reminded you who you are." He fell quiet, then stepped forward, pulling her into a hug, unhurried, unshaken for the first time, embracing as a man standing inside his own home. That night, the city wind didn't ease, but in the third-floor room, new sounds filled the air. Max's steady breathing, the kettle's low boil, the scratch of a pen across paper, as David wrote out the next week's schedule and taped it to the fridge. In the corner, he drew a small box and marked it, "Tomorrow," a word that had returned to the realm of plans. And when the lights went out, he knew if the past tugged at him again, there were other hands now, holding on, keeping him on the right side of the door. After moving into the small third-floor apartment, David B's name on the duty board was no longer a dry erase line that could be wiped away. The weekly schedule printed from the admin office now had a new column interpreter, community liaison. Rachel peeled the sheet off and pinned it to his locker, pointing out the fixed morning shift and the flexible afternoon shift, then stepped aside so he could take it in himself. David didn't say much, only gave a slight nod when he saw his name aligned neatly in its row and column, the feeling of being placed somewhere he hadn't touched in years. "The city's saying your name now," Rachel teased, handing him a local paper's story about the shed rescue. David looked embarrassed, setting the paper down as if it were fragile. "Don't let cameras lead you off course." He said his words spare but precise, the way he'd spoken since that night in the rain. On Thursday evening, the community hall opened its doors. No banners, no grand stage, just a low wooden platform, a few folding chairs, and a scuffed microphone. Parents brought children, some carried baked goods, and local officials sat front row with notebooks. Max was the unplanned star kids lined up to pet his ears, giggling whenever his tag jingled. The host thanked the man who helped find the Rodriguez boy, then invited David to speak. He stepped up slowly, hand steadying itself on Max's leash. "I'm not a hero," he began, voice even. "I'm just someone given another chance. Don't look at me. Look at the people you pass every day. They matter too." The room hushed for a beat, then applause spread steady as rain, not festival loud, but enduring. Afterward, a boy of about 16 approached, shoulders stiff from trying not to look nervous. I wanted to ask about what happened at the market," he muttered, eyes flicking toward friends leaning against the wall. David didn't ask why, didn't use words like guidance or transformation. He simply said, "Meet me at the court tomorrow, then let the boy take Max for a lap around the yard." From a distance, Rachel watched the boy's shoulders drop just slightly at realizing he could hold a leash. The dog would obey. Sometimes control over one thing is the first step toward control over yourself. The next day at the precinct, Captain Miller quietly signed an internal order, shifting David from temporary to fixed part-time, with a small stipend and a written role description. "It's not a medal," he told Rachel during shift change, "but it's a rivet holding up a new bridge." On the whiteboard, someone scribbled in marker, "David and Max, our shortcut through fear." No one erased it. Work carried itself down subtle paths. At noon, David helped an elderly woman fill out a health aid form. In the afternoon, he translated for a family reporting a stolen motorbike. By evening, he and Rachel swung by the alley behind the church to remind a group of teens about curfew. Max was always in the middle, a wagging tail badge that softened the air. The kids would crouch to pet him before daring to lift their eyes and tell the adults the truth. On Saturday, a neighborhood safety workshop invited David as a guest speaker, but he declined the stage. Instead, he sat below, quietly advising a single father on how to tell his 10-year-old son that mom has gone away, and it's not his fault. Rachel glanced over, thinking that some of the best speeches never use a microphone. Late one afternoon, Miller passed the front desk and caught David showing a young couple the way to the welfare office, reminding them, "Go early before the numbers run out," then hoisting their heavy bags himself. Miller lingered longer than necessary, then turned to Rachel. "Lock his schedule in for next quarter," he said shortly. Rachel answered with a clipped "Yes, sir," but as she turned away, the corner of her mouth rose. The finest result of any system isn't a speech, but a habit of kindness written into the roster as if it had always belonged. That night in the third-floor apartment, David stuck another note to the fridge. Tuesday, neighborhood parent meeting. Max bath, Thursday. Rachel laughed at the second line. "Why so big?" she asked. David winked. "So I don't forget." "And if you do, I'll remind you," she said, and that simple joke warmed the kitchen one shade brighter. Not every day was sunlight spilling across wooden floors. The next month, a social media post exaggeratedly calling him a hero drew bitter comments coddled because he looks pitiful. David didn't read them, he told Rachel so, but she knew the words still slipped under doors like a cold draft. One evening, David skipped his afternoon shift. The borrowed phone was off. The apartment door was locked. After her shift, Rachel checked the church, the soup kitchen asked around under the bridge, then finally parked by the dry canal where she knew he sometimes sat when he needed quiet. He was there, shoulders hunched on the cement step, Max's head resting on his knee, eyes half open. Rachel didn't ask, why didn't, throw out ready-made explanations. She sat down beside him, close enough to mean same side, far enough not to crowd his space. The trickle in the canal below tapped like dry seeds rolling over steel. "Sometimes I think I'm just acting a part," David said at last words, dropping slow as stones. "Back then, the thing I was best at was disappearing." Rachel nodded, resisting the reflex to argue. "If you need to disappear for a while, do it," she said, eyes on the water. "Just send me one word so I know how tight to hold the leash. Not choking, just steady." Max shifted, nuzzling her hand as if in agreement. The next morning, David showed up at the precinct on time, hair tied neatly with a new band shirt ironed sharper than usual. He began the day by helping an elderly woman fill out a utilities complaint form, then moved a misplaced box at the intake desk. When Rachel passed, he paused, a beat lifted his head. "Thanks for not asking last night." "Thanks for not disappearing last night." She replied, the words falling out so naturally they both smiled in silence. That afternoon they were called to an old warehouse where a scuffle was escalating. Two groups of teens squared off. In the middle stood a boy. Rachel recognized the cap-wearing kid from the basketball court, taller, now with anger. David didn't charge in as a hero. He stayed beside Rachel, letting her follow procedure while he translated the room's pounding pulse into slower, calmer sentences. "They just need an exit that lets them save face," he murmured, nodding toward the window. Rachel caught it, stepped back half a pace to leave the boy space, not corner him. Max lay down between the groups, panting like a small pump, pushing tension out of the air. Finally, someone muttered, "Tomorrow," as a way out, and the crowd dissolved. The window welcomed a salty gust from the canal. That night, Rachel invited David over for chicken soup, the dish she made whenever she needed, reminding that some things only turned good when simmered low. He stood at the sink washing bowls with slow, deliberate strokes, soap bubbles bunching like small clouds. "Sometimes I look in the mirror and wonder, what does she see in me?" he admitted, eyes on the water. "A man who knows how to come back on time," Rachel said, setting the towel across the basin. "A man who doesn't use his past as an excuse to hurt others. A man who holds the leash right." The third line made David laugh. Max raised his head as if he understood. That weekend, Captain Miller called Rachel in, asking about the community walk-alongs and the Catboy at the court. Rachel gave a brief, unsugar-coated report. Miller nodded, said, "Keep it that way," then added suddenly, "Don't let outside write-ups define you. We define ourselves by the work." He handed her a thin envelope, an invitation to the city's commendation ceremony for community safety. "Give this to Brooks Miller," said. "Tell him to show up, and tell him to wear a light shirt. Photos come out better." On the morning of the ceremony, the sun was pale. David fumbled with the light blue shirt Rachel insisted on. Max wore a small bow, not too gaudy. When he stepped up to the podium, he didn't replay the rainy alley or the rusted lock. He repeated what he believed, "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone given another chance. Please don't stop at me. Look at the people you pass every day." This time, the applause swelled from more rows rolling all the way to the hall's doors. Rachel stood at the edge, hand clenching, then loosening as he stepped down. She took his hand in the courtyard amid chatter and camera flashes. As always, he hesitated half a beat, then let warmth thread through their fingers. Late that night, the third-floor apartment glowed amber again. Max slept by the window paws, twitching in dreams. David taped a new note to the fridge Wednesday. School meeting with the basketball boys' parents. Underneath, Rachel added in marker, "Tomorrow, don't forget to bring your smile." He looked at the line, gave a nod both to her and to himself. The headwinds were still out there, but the leash was held together now, and the anchor named Max lay right where it belonged on the wooden floor by the window. Wednesday morning, right on schedule from the fridge note, David sat in on the parent meeting at the school of the basketball court boy. The talk went smoothly, teachers listened. The father found words to tell his son without laying an invisible weight on his small shoulders. Rachel waited in the hall with Max, tossing him a treat each time the door creaked open, then shut. When David stepped out, she just lifted a thumb. No words, knowing the most. Durable joy's the kind that doesn't need framing. That noon at the precinct, the sort of thing no system wants but any can stumble on, happened a complainant's wallet, vanished in the intake room. Rumor moved like wind through vents. Eyes flicked almost unconsciously toward the once homeless black man taking notes for his afternoon shift. No one spoke it, but invisible cords tightened. Rachel stood, first, voice low but steady. Lock the room. Check every person's rote. Pull the ceiling cam. Captain Miller stepped out just in time, slicing through the whispers. No guessing. We go on evidence. 30 minutes was enough to retrain the eyes. Camera footage showed the wallet sliding off the counter when a child clutching a doll leaned in. Later, a man scooping papers accidentally knocked it further back. Rachel signaled Maxfind. He slipped under, nosed through the dust, and emerged with the wallet wedged against the table leg. The owner was sheepish but relieved. The eyes that had doubted now had nowhere to hang. David only patted Max's shoulder, staying at the edge of the light, letting the facts speak. Miller, passing by, paused half a beat and said loud enough for all, "Thank you, Brooks." And thank you, Max. That public thanks, short and exact, tightened the bolt on a bridge that had wavered. That same afternoon, a call sent the unit to Warehouse Rose by the canal, a fight between two smuggling crews. Radio said knives and pipes. Rachel and David arrived with the first team. The half-dark alley oil fumes and cold metal carried an echo of their first night, though neither said it. Scanning the positions, David spoke quickly. Calm left's a dead end. If you go there, they'll box you classic stack. Go straight, give them an exit to save face, then pull Group A right through that iron gate with the busted lock. Rachel nodded instantly. His street sense was no longer scattered instinct, but tactical language. She swept her light spoke in an even tone to outline a face-saving retreat while signaling her team to rig a barrier where David pointed. Max on command planted himself square in the middle line, panting like a small pump easing the air pressure. When a bottle shattered underfoot, the crowd had exits enough to step back instead of surging forward. Two men were separated. First, a knife kicked aside the metallic clatter ringing like that rainy night echo. Rachel locked the danger down with clipped orders and the familiar click of cuffs. This time, the ending wasn't jagged. It was smooth like a problem solved with the right equation. Again, Rachel said, as they walked out of the alley, leaving the rest unsaid. David shrugged, exhaled a laugh. This time, because we listened. That night on the balcony of the third-floor apartment, Rachel poured tea steam unraveling in faint threads. Sometimes I want to flare up at the looks I saw at noon, she admitted, eyes on the river of cars below. David shook his head, gave it plain as ever. Don't waste fire on those who don't see. Use it to light the way. The line snuffed out the need for excuses, resetting the day's weight of false suspicion undone by evidence, a hot street standoff eased by lived knowledge folded into procedure. The system had learned one more way to stand on the right side, not by speeches, but by doing the work right. The season shifted quietly. Mornings carried a thin layer of mist. The hawthorn tree outside the third-floor apartment window deepened in color, and David's now-printed schedule bore a new fixed-entry mentor: Maple Court Saturdays. At the precinct, the whiteboard filled with details that looked trivial, but framed a community interpreter hours, soup kitchen hotline updates, pet vaccination reminders for nearby tenants. Someone had doodled a smiley face next to Max's name. Captain Miller spoke less about a special case, more about a new process, how to use those who knew the streets, as the soft map to pair with the hard one. One evening, Rachel and David were invited to the city's Police Community Engagement Forum. They brought no slides. Rachel spoke for 3 minutes about the night of rain, the whispered, "Don't talk, just listen," the warning shot, and the wrist lock by a man without a badge. David spoke for less than 3, about opportunity and purpose, about how being called by his right name had straightened his stance as a man. The rest was Q&A with one answer he repeated most. If you want to start tomorrow, start with one look that doesn't pass over. Sometimes David still lost sleep. The past doesn't leave for the price of a few articles and a new apartment. On such nights he texted Rachel a single word. Okay, so she wouldn't wait up. Then brewed tea, sat on the floor with his back to the couch, watching Max's steady breathing. And Rachel still pulled hard shifts. Still met narrow eyes, but now she had another way to use her fire, as David had said, to light the way for the right people, the right work. One weekend, Miller called them both in. He laid a thin folder on the desk. Shift from trial to official. Community liaison, part-time, fixed with a stipend, raised job description, and ethics code. Rachel looked at David. David looked down at Max's leash, then signed his name firm enough not to snap, soft enough not to break. Miller stood to shake his hand, speaking a line he rarely used. "It's an honor to work with you, Brooks." In the lobby, a small round of applause broke out unplanned. No banners, just the easing smiles of people who once looked wrong and now knew how to look right. That night, they walked under a light drizzle. Street lamps spilled yellow squares on wet pavement, stretching long with Max's every step. Rachel teased, mimicking that hoarse voice from before, "Don't talk, just listen." David laughed, turned. "So what do I listen to now?" She tilted her head, brushed his shoulder, and in the rain came a sound you only notice after walking together long enough, breathing in sync. "Listen for tomorrow," Rachel said. "And if tomorrow's hard, we'll hold the leash for each other." Back at the apartment, they shook off raincoats and set water to boil. David opened the fridge. Inside was the new schedule boxes filled morning shifts, community sessions, court mentoring resident meetings, and one more in Rachel's marker dinner with the Rodriguez family. Thanks for a safe year. He stood longer than usual, then drew a small square in the corner and marked it, "Tomorrow." The habit had become a ritual. Before bed, he placed a fresh photo on the shelf Max sprawled across his old boots, while he and Rachel sat beside, laughing away from the camera. Underneath he scrawled, "Heroes can wear rags," not to remind others but himself that the arc doesn't end at recognition, but begins at belonging in a community that corrects its mistakes in a system learning to breathe slower in a home, with a dog's steady breath by the window. Outside, the rain thickened. Inside, the lights glowed warm. And if one day in another alley someone whispered, "Don't talk, just listen," they would know what to do. Listen to each other, listen to the city, then step forward, each hand on the leash, so no one slips past safety just because they were overlooked. The night of rain that began with "Don't talk, just listen," ended with a warm home, a new work schedule, and a leash of trust binding Rachel Cole, David Brooks, and Max. It reminds us that when a person is seen and given purpose, both they and their community are transformed for the better. Heroes don't always wear badges. Sometimes they just quietly do what's right. Which moment of Rachel David Max's journey touched you the most, and why? If you found this story meaningful, hit like, share it with friends, and subscribe. Don't forget the bell so you won't miss the next episodes.